Stay right there. What are you waiting for? Kill them! Kill them both! No, wait a minute. Is it money you're after? I'll give you as much as you want.
May the saints forgive you, because I won't.
So here we go, recording. So I'm with David Chaim Smith, I'll say it properly, who is an amazing artist, incredible Kabbalist, and someone I'm very flattered that is like in my sphere of dialogue, and someone that I'm a little scared to have on the show simply because he's a much greater thinker than I think I deserve, maybe, but I hope that we can have a very fruitful conversation, and people can sort of see what is very profound and moving about his work for me particularly, but I hope that everybody finds the conversation and David's work moving. And David, do you want to, I'm sorry, I'm a little nervous. Do you want to just introduce yourself and just talk about your work a little bit and some of the newer books that you have published? And I know you just published a new one, and I'll make sure that all the links are in the show notes as well, so everybody can check them out and buy them, hopefully. And also just talk about a little of your background and how you sort of got started. We were talking a little pre-recording about a sort of axial pivot point for yourself, and if you want to go into that a little bit, that would be great. Thank you so much for coming on.
Sure. I really appreciate that intro. My name's David Chaim Smith. I am not scary or intimidating at all as a person, I don't think. So there's no reason for you to be nervous. I am what is called, self-called, I guess, an esoteric cartographer, which means that I map out my own inquiry into mystical exploration without claiming any kind of accomplishment or fluency in any particular system. It's not really about that. It's more a free-form exploration that bears notation. And the kind of notation that I produce comes in the form of drawings and writings, which I publish, that I make public so people can follow my explorations somewhat and adapt and use them for their own purposes. And it's not that I'm providing any kind of definitive data, quite the opposite. What I produce is a work in progress. It's constantly being refined. I'm constantly thinking and then rethinking and exploring and re-exploring ever deeper into territories that I try to make clear through my drawings and writings, which I publish in the form of books. And I speak about it, and I've got an extensive, varied background with unusual elements in it, which we can talk about. And I've been doing this for over 30 years, and I'm in my mid-60s, so there's quite a bit of material there. And I've gone through many different phases of development where the work has progressed. So there's a variety of approaches. And based on this form, which I call esoteric cartography, there are different aspects and different ways to approach it. You can actually approach it as a kind of a symbol play, where I use evocative poetics to try to call up and extrude sensations and resonant feeling tones of beauty and astonishment that I unearth through the process of doing my practice and engaging in my work. And being a kind of an explorer is the point. And what I would like my work to do with others is encourage other people to explore in an open-ended manner, using good sources, the best sources that can be found, and by digging in and using the precious opportunity of our life to realize what is right in front of our eyes to be realized. And really, that's what it's all about. It encourages all of us to become open-ended practitioners that are not beholden to any authority or fixed system. I hope that made sense. Do you have any questions about that?
It absolutely made sense. I think that's what I find attractive about your work in toto, is that it is you do have a flexible, fluid, syncretic, but not it's non-dogmatic, but it's not syncretic in the way that people are used to hearing that word. So I don't even know if that's even the right. That's maybe a poor klipa to use one of your, to borrow your language, but I think that it does accurately describe something that you're doing, where you're trying to resolve certain systemic parallels that are very much in common. And we don't have to necessarily get into what those parallels are, but I think that there are things in that you are both untangling and resolving. So I'm very interested in that aspect of it. And I know that you are on the cutting edge of some very interesting sort of Klipothic work in translating very rare texts and like looking at the diagrams for some of the Lurianic texts. I know that that's something you and I have discussed before. Do you find that useful in sort of the greater understanding? Because that's many people's starting point, David, is sort of like what the modern left-hand path calls like the Klipothic work. That's how most people on the internet, most millennials, most people who are not buying Llewellyn books, at least, that's how most people are engaging with Kabbalah to begin with.
Okay,
So,
well, let's look at that language for a minute. When I use the term klipa or klipot, plural, this is what Hermetic Kabbalists put a th on the end, call it the klipoth, but there's no th sound in Hebrew, really. It's klipot is the plural, klipa is singular. What is that? Well, a klipa, in my estimation, is a fixed mental construct. Could be a thought, could be a sense perception, could be a feeling, could be an amorphous sensation in the visionary register, could be just like a passing emotion, could be a concept, doesn't matter. Anything that has a border or a boundary that can be defined, that defining boundary creates a sort of a shell or a skin for what we could say is kind of like a bubble, where the defined content is contained by that parameter. So that defined entity that lives within the klipa, lives within the shell, meets its definition and doesn't exceed it, meaning it has an end point, meaning it's fixed or limited, which implies that beyond it is infinite possibility. And that's kind of the way that conventional conceptuality works. it moves discursively from one perception that is limited and fixed to the next, and then to the next, and then to the next, and that's discursivity. And for conceptually fixated beings, the mind is just a series of little bubbles or shelled constructs or limited defined frameworks that network together and conglomerate and form associative patterns. So what conceptuality does, what ordinary thinking does for a human being, is just create associative relationships between bounded concepts, which are incredibly complex and endlessly variable. And moving from one region of associative networking activity to the next is shared from person to person. And that's how language works. And that's how a world of bits of data becomes interchangeable. And what mysticism does, and this is the interesting part, is it attacks the problem at the root. And the root is in the limitation or the shells of the constructs themselves. And what it institutes is a type of vision that allows meaning to become permeable so that the shells are no longer opaque, fixed boundaries, but become transparent and translucent and breathable. So the associative patterns, which are really like prison cells for the mind, can start to open up. They don't go away. We're not eradicating thoughts and feelings and perceptions whatsoever, but we're allowing something infinitely more subtle to penetrate and pervade, so that that penetration and pervasion becomes the main point. And that's an aspect of meaning that is completely open and mirror-like and lucid and vivid, and ultimately is replete with the essence of life force. And what happens is that as you make this transition between fixed parts in their complex relationships and open-ended vastness, the point of view shifts, the nature of meaning shifts, the purpose of meaning shifts from closed circuits to that which is infinite and completely expansive. And that shift is the decisive one. It changes the nature of meaning itself. And this is what allows a person's mind to break out of the constraints of conventionality and enter into Gnosis, which is what everybody's concerned with. I mean, you mentioned various forms of Hermetic inquiry. I think almost everyone can agree that whatever Gnosis is for different groups and different people, that's really the point. The point is our awakening. The point is the ability to wake up from this semi-comatose discursive state, which is like a kind of blindness, kind of spiritual blindness, and waking up from that slumber, which means a whole lot of things to a whole lot of people. Whatever that is where the point is going to be found, and that's where people need to talk to each other about what's really important and what life is all about. Hopefully, we could get very clear about that and talk about that in a manner that makes sense, rather than hide behind esoteric language and systems and assumptions and philosophical stances. Let's try to yank some of that away and just speak simply and clearly about what are we doing this for? What's the point of all of this? That's what we should really be coming together to discuss. Why is the work important? So you can ask me anything you want about that. I'll try to be as clear as I can.
Well, thank you so much for that, David. I think I'll take it in this direction, and you can, work your way on the path back to a different point if that's what you want. But I'm going to ask you something very plain spoken. Is Gnosis non-dual?
Yeah.
In your opinion?
For me, from my point of view, Gnosis is the realization of non-duality. And when I say non-duality, what I'm talking about are contrasts that support the type of defining limitations that I just mentioned that go into making a mental construct bounded or limited. What makes limitations? What makes things separate from each other so that they can be compared to other things? Well, those are dualistic distinctions, dualistic constructs. And the main dualistic contrast that supports divisions and reifications, and we could talk about what that means, is this schism between a perceiving subject, which is that which knows, and a perceived object, which is that which becomes known. In Kabbalah, the knower and the thing known are generally divided into the categories of levels of the soul, levels of consciousness, perceiving consciousness, and perceived contexts with all the objects that fill those contexts. And these are generally known as the worlds. So as the soul aspects progress through the contextual aspects, which are the worlds, you have this interchange between a set of epistemological calibrations, degrees of knowing, and ontological calibrations, degrees that can be known, degrees of being. So between epistemology and ontology, you have what's called the Hishtalshelus, which is the chain of sphirot in worlds that pertain both to soul and realm. And almost all of Kabbalah is concerned with articulating this vast hierarchical ladder of classification. Where I come in, and what I do that is a little bit different, is no matter where you are on this ladder-like hierarchical chain, my true belief is that you can cut to the essential ground of phenomena, which does not change and cannot be altered, no matter what kind of calibration or form might express it. From the lowest to the highest, you can cut to what we call the Or Ein Sof, the essential nature of reality. And that is the essence of the whole path. So I'm not denying that the hierarchical placement game characterizes what phenomena does. It certainly, obviously, is a very sophisticated system for doing that. It's a taxonomical system. It's a classification system. But no matter where you are in that system of classifications, the ground of phenomena is all pervasive, is absolutely supporting whatever ornament-like expression is exuded, and you can always cut directly to the heart of the matter. You could always cut to the essence, no matter where you are or what you're doing, how high or how low. The essence of reality is the Or Ein Sof. And that is a little bit of a different perspective.
It's interesting because you brought it to exactly what I was going to ask you next, as my next question was, where would you point on the tree or on the esoteric cartography, if you want to call it that, to where is the sort of quote unquote soteriological goal? I know that's not your language, but I'm trying to be flexible. But because you've already answered that, maybe our next question should be something that caught me right away when I read my, as is, one of my most prized Kabbalah books of all is Blazing Drew of Stars, of course, which is your book. You talk about sort of like a non-theistic approach to Kabbalah. Can you get into that, David, and explain what you mean and like use your kind of framework and words? Because I think that is also a kind of a radical, it's not a division, but a radical change of framework or view than how Kabbalah is often approached.
Well, the Kabbalistic system was formulated for the most part by theists. And no matter how esoteric it got throughout the centuries, it always deferred back to a core belief in a first cause of creation. A first cause of creation, meaning a creator God, which in and of itself is uncreated, created the world at a point in time. And this is the exoteric view. This is the common conventional view of religion, that the creator God in the beginning created what we call the primordial tzimtzum, the space of creation, and then filled it with all the possibilities that bore themselves out in time. That's the conventional view. So the great majority of Kabbalah, no matter how esoteric it gets, doesn't deviate really that much from that core theistic religious belief. What I do is utterly and completely opposed to that, because I am espousing a view that is completely spontaneous and acausal, that doesn't have any beginning point or ending point, and doesn't hold a belief either in a first cause creator God or in an act of creation or in any created entity. So I don't believe that there is a creator, and I don't believe that there is anything that has been created, and I'm not even concerned that much with the creative process. My concern is really totally different. My concern is with the essence of phenomena, beyond time, beyond space, beyond concept, beyond even the dichotomy between being and non-being. And that is really a very different kind of view. Once you eliminate the framework of the religious mythology, what you're really doing is cutting through all causal explanations. And I'm not denying that things appear causally. It seems like things beget other things in a chain, right? It seems like there is a progression called time. There are discrete objects and places in space in their dimensions, and there are individual concepts. I'm not denying that this arises. That's not even my issue. My issue is, what is the essence of all of it? What is the essential nature? What is really important about reality, no matter what it appears to be doing? And that's my issue. So the reason why my view is a non-theistic one is I'm simply not interested in the theistic mythology, or refuting it, or justifying it, or playing the game with it at all. I'm just cutting to the actual heart of the matter as I see it, which is, no matter what phenomena arises, what is its nature? What is its essence? What knows it? What is the essence of what knows it? What is the essence of what becomes known? That's the only question that seems interesting to me. So I leave it for others to debate and discuss the vicissitudes of theism. I'm just simply, it's none of my business. So as a non-theistic practitioner who is exclusively interested in the essence of things, the question is, how do we make clear our inquiry into the question of essentiality? How do we immerse in it until every other concern is outshined? That's, to me, what matters. That makes me a mystic. and not, for example, a magical practitioner or a proponent of esoteric religious thought or a scholar. I'm not any of those things. I'm just a mystical practitioner who maps out my exploration. And that's pretty much all I do.
I mean, it sounds incredible, like a hyperspace traveler who wouldn't want to be called that or self-describe as that. I definitely would. I love that too about mysticism versus or being a mystic rather than being like an esotericist, like a practical esotericist where you're doing magic as like a formulation. So I appreciate all of that. And I also appreciate the idea of the inquiry into phenomena. That's also what I'm interested in more than anything else.
Yeah. And I'm differentiating this approach to, for example, the approach of theurgy, which is a theistically based form of communion with the sacred, a working of divinity. My relationship to the divine, being a non-theistic relationship, is not theurgical. So there's an interesting conversation I have with theurgists because I'm not refuting their work. What I'm doing can actually be adopted by their work. And what I found is that because I take the approach that I do, my work can become valuable to people from a variety of different points of view whose opinions about these matters differ substantially from what I'm talking about. It does not matter. My work is extremely adaptable to different contexts. So like I said, theurgists can adopt aspects of it that can really enhance what they're doing, even though I might not agree with all aspects of it and might have issue with the theistic aspects of it. It doesn't mean that there isn't something that I've unearthed and mapped that can't be relatable to what they're doing directly. And that's why a lot of different communities of people tend to enjoy access to my work. It's not because they're changing from what they're doing to agree with me. Quite the opposite. What I'm doing deepens the dimension with which they're doing whatever they're doing. So it's that adaptability which becomes important. It's not a dogmatic thing where I'm stating a definitive system and you can perform my system the way that I mean it to be performed. I'm not throwing out a trail of breadcrumbs and saying, follow this. What I'm doing is producing a series of explorations that should be beneficial to almost anybody, because my concerns are really everybody's concerns. What knows reality? What is known in reality? What is the essence of both what is known and what knows? That's my concern. Isn't that everybody's concern?
Well, as you know, David, that I think people are not that concerned with ontology in the general public. But hopefully people will listen to this. And if you listen to my show or you listen to David on his channel or any of his work, I think that this is probably a question that you are interested in. So I'm glad that you addressed it. I do want to sort of ask you a question that you might find paradoxical. But I think it's important for people to hear. And I think I'm also interested in your answer. What is the nature of the Shekinah or the female principle in your system, in your view?
In order for me to answer that question, whoever's listening to the answer might be well suited to know a little bit of Kabbalah, like to know the basic tree. Because the way that I would like to answer that is by referring to the Sefirot. There are two Sefirot on the tree that have the disposition associated with the Shekinah. The primary one is Binah, and the echo of that is known as Malkuth. When the principal divine name is attributed to the Sefirot, Yud He Vav He. The Yud is Keter and Chokmah. The first He is Binah. The middle six Sfirot is Vav. And the final He is Malkuth. So when the name is laid out in correspondence fashion to the Sfirot, the two Sfirot that bear the He's of the name, which is the same letter, are Binah and Malkuth, and that's a female letter. The nature of femaleness in this sense has to do with space and has to do with the nature of the expanse of reality in two ways. From the perspective of Binah, it's what we would call basic space, or pure, unadulterated, open possibility, which is the capacity for anything and everything to be expressed. It's absolutely limitless and irreducible. By the same token, that being Binah, right? By the same token, Malkuth is the field of display of seemingly precise, specific, relative objects, coordinates, moments in time, ideas and feelings, and what have you. In other words, we have a display of every particular thing, and that's Malkuth, and then we have the expanse of open possibility that makes it possible, and that's Binah. The confluence of both of those things, the Binah aspect and the Malkuth aspect, that's what the Shekinah is. The Shekinah is both the array of the presence of reality as well as the open capacity for reality. Once we realize that those two aspects have a common essence, both the relative and the specific, and the absolute and the hyper possible. We're talking here about immanence and transcendence, right? When we realize that there is no separation between them at all, that their essence is absolutely a singular continuum. That open-ended presencing reality that can be or do anything, including the awareness that knows it, right? That's Shekinah. That's the divinity of the Shekinah. And that's the entrance point into an investigation through the field of reality itself as to what is essential in our inquiry, in contemplation, in meditation, and in our spiritual work. Our spiritual work is immersion into that heart of the matter that we're calling Shekinah. Now, the reason why it's Shekinah and the reason why it's a female aspect is because this aspect of space is literally a womb that gives birth to all things. But the womb itself is unalterable, is irreducible, can't be modified, can't be conditioned. It's a completely unconditioned capacity to produce all conditions. So in the Christian sense, this is what we call Mary. This is the virgin birth. This is literally the virgin birth of all things. And one particular very dear symbol to me of this is a rare and rarely discussed aspect of Mary in the Christian tradition, which is the Black Madonna. Black is the night sky, a form of blackness which is not dark in contrast to that which is light. Because from the supernal perspective, both the Sfirot of Chokmah and Binah are non-dual. Chokmah is luminosity, but a luminosity that is a dark luminosity. And Binah, the expansive space that I've been talking about, is a luminous darkness. So when you immerse and become absorbed within that darkness and mystical experience, it's not a void. It's not an empty nothingness. It's an absolute fullness that is so replete with possibility. In other words, it's a darkness that is so replete with light that there is no refraction point. And this is the same kind of question that you would have when you ask, what does the mind do when there's no thing, no limited thing to perceive? Right? What does awareness do when there is no limitation? What can be perceived? Because all specific perceptions are defined by what limits them, right? Like we're saying, what all specific perceptions do is gets defined by the klipot, the networks of associative patterns that they're involved in. So what does the mind do when it's not limited by specific forms of perceiving? Well, what is awareness in and of itself? It has no end. It's absolutely infinite. You can't define it. There is no experience. There is no phenomena that sums it up. So the Shekinah, in this sense, is unknowable, but it's an infinitely full unknowability. And the form of unknowing that becomes realized is a pervasive fullness that changes the nature of knowing. So once it is reconciled, this dichotomy between knowing and unknowing kind of gets erased, and phenomena itself arise, but their meaning opens up into infinity. And even finite things can express the infinite in this regard when we realize that whatever is perceived and whatever perceives it is the product of this virgin birth, the product of this transcendent immanentness, we could say. And we call that Gnosis. You with me, Jin?
I'm listening. I'm absorbing it. Everybody who knows me will know that I'm like just so full of I'm just so excited and nervous and also like absorbing everything you say. So usually it's me, David, that does I mean, I'm not half the Kabbalist you are, but it's usually me doing like your role. But in this case, it's a little bit of an inversion of the polarities, but that's okay. I'm okay with that. I accept that. But I'm with you, and I think that was an incredible answer. And I think that the idea of Binah and Chokmah being non-dual at the supernal layer, I think makes a lot of sense to me personally.
Yeah. Now, in practice, in contemplative practice, we could say that although Chokmah and Binah are non-dual, and the space of Binah is replete with Chokmah, and they're inseparable from each other, they're in an inseparable union with each other, still, they do have specific roles to play at the same time. So it's not that Chokmah and Binah are just the same thing. They are two sefirot that perform different functions, even though they are part of a union, an indestructible union with each other. Essentially the union of light and space, right?
Absolutely.
Still they have specific roles to play. So they are used quite differently in very complex ways. And we can't gloss over that fact. But the main question, and this is a discussion that we should probably have, because you're coming from this point of view of Hermetic Kabbalah, what I'm perceiving, I don't know you well enough to say you're coming from this perspective, but many people who are listening to you undoubtedly will be coming from the perspective of Hermetic Kabbalah. And Hermetic Kabbalah generally uses a form of the sefirot, a form of the tree that posits an abyss between the lower seven sefirot and the upper three sefirot. And that's a big issue for me, this issue of the abyss, because it only pertains to the form of the tree where the quasi-sphera of Daath is inserted between Keter, Chokmah, and Binah, and the lower seven below it. And many systems are poised at that abyss and crossing the abyss and approaching the abyss like it's fixed in reality, which it isn't, because the abyss is created by this quasi-sphera of Daath. Daath is just your own conceptuality.
Mhm.
When you practice beyond conceptuality, no abyss. The abyss just goes away. So there are two primary forms of the tree that I can show you. I can show you a diagram from 1728. I could show you a diagram from the 14th century that shows not only forms of the tree without this interval of Daath between the upper three and the lower seven, but once you take that interval away, the whole middle pillar goes up a notch. So the order of the sphirot changes. And when there is no Daath, the order goes Keter, Chokmah, Binah, Tiferet, Chesed, Gevura, Yesod, Hod, Netzach, Malkuth. You with me?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm not saying that one form of the tree is right and the other form of the tree is wrong. What I'm saying is that these two forms, the form with the descended middle pillar with Daath and the form of the tree without Daath and the ascended middle pillar, these are the two trees of the Garden of Eden referred to in the first chapter of Genesis. One is the tree of knowledge, and the word for knowledge is Daath in Hebrew, and the other is the tree of life. And they're meant to be used together. One is not right, the other is not wrong. They are aspects of a singularity which is complete and whole. And if you can realize the nature of that singularity, it doesn't matter whether you realize it or not. The essence doesn't change, which means that even in our delusion, there is a primordial purity that is unchangeable, essential. That is the heart of the matter. And once you develop certainty and faith in that unchangeable ground of reality, even the klipot are primordially pure. And that's a controversial statement.
Yes, it is. Maybe you'll find this amusing, but actually one of my questions a little ways back was about the nature of Daath, because I know that you position it flexibly, we'll call it, as you laid out. So thank you so much for giving that, David. I appreciate that.
Well,
I'm sure everybody...
let me make one last statement about that
Okay,
before
absolutely.
we move on.
Please.
The main point that I'm trying to make here is that conceptuality is not necessarily a problem. Klipot are not necessarily problems. Daath is not necessarily a problem. It's all a matter of your interpretation. You see the difference?
There should be a flexibility in view and ability to reflexively utilize different systems at different, if you want to call them path workings or different kinds of meditations on the Sephirot. That's my opinion.
Well, let's go a little further. What I'm doing is a direct attack, and this is the only thing that I'm attacking. I'm attacking the implicit faith in dualism. And if you have dualism, you have good and evil, you have right and wrong, you have yes and no, you have subject and object. To cut through all of that at the root allows those very contrasts to arise unencumbered by the issues that they convey. So duality is not necessarily a problem as long as you cut through an implicit superficial view in it. That's the difference. Whereas if I was a strict dogmatic non-dualist, I would say that duality is right, and that non-duality is right, and duality is wrong. But what I'm saying is actually way more subtle than that. What I'm saying is to choose non-duality over duality is itself dualistic.
I actually agree with you 100%, David. I think that it can be a useful, skillful tool, and I don't reject it fully as a conceptual idea. And I also think that yeah, like my personal greater project is perhaps to in a small way insert this kernel of non-dual metaphysics or ways of thinking of the world into like my show and what I talk about when I go on other people's shows, but I do not also expect other people to adopt it simply because if they're not willing to sort of discard what you are calling correctly a superficial view of it, it's probably better that they, they have to do a lot of the work on their own is what I've sort of encountered. I don't know how you feel about that, but
Well,
for
the way
me,
that I'll answer that question, the way
okay,
I feel about it is, I'm only concerned with my own practice. I don't know what other people are doing, and it's none of my business.
I agree.
I'm not trying to change hearts and minds. I'm not involved in regime change. I just do my
Fair
own
enough.
work. I live in retreat. I'm a full-time retreatant. I do my work. I put out my books. If people want to listen to it and, benefit from it, that's what it's there for. If not, which I assume is the case most of the time, is that people wouldn't care. I don't have anything to say about that. I'm just going to do my work like the sparrow chirping away in the meadow,
I like that metaphor. For the record, I am not trying to change hearts and minds or do any kind of social change, but I like to express what I think are ideas closer to the contour of the truth, what I perceive as the truth, maybe, but a little closer. So I think a non-dual approach is an interesting, perspectival relationship with metaphysics and magic. Even though I agree that both of those things are sort of outer phenomenological klepots, ways to describe things that are probably of the mind.
Well, not
So
necessarily, because if we are to view reality itself as magical, and I'm talking about on the so-called ordinary level, like I'm sitting in a room, I'm looking at objects, I'm looking at out the window at a tree and the sky. These are magical presentations. What allows me to view a world in which there's no such thing as ordinary phenomena? What happens when this so-called dividing line between the ordinary and the non-ordinary gets erased? What happens when I aspire to live a magical life, a life where appearance itself is a miracle, is an absolute astonishing visionary array, although nothing unusual needs to happen? Well, isn't that the goal? Isn't the goal to allow meaning to rise like the phoenix out of the ashes of, the semi-comatose assumptions that we make into a sky and become that sky? The goal is to live magically on the highest level, to realize the essence of phenomena, which is purely amazing. If that is what we're in it for, which I can't imagine anybody saying differently. I can't imagine anybody saying that they want to live a boring, reductive life instead. If that's really the goal, then we have to treat reality magically, which involves treating our perception of it magically. So it becomes the essence of magic. And this factors into every so-called magical system. That if these magical systems want to be truly magical, they can't just be formulas where you say the right word and you call up the right sensation with the right color and the right musical note and the right incense and the right implement. It's not just a formula that can be concocted mechanically. There has to be something magical about it at the root. And that's why I think that the work that I do deeply relates to magical systems. And I have no problem with anybody doing any form of magic and utilizing my material with it, because that's what it's there for. I hope that people use my work and adapt it to these contexts that I haven't even dreamed of. I'm not telling anybody what to do.
Well, I don't know if you'll be surprised by this, but I specifically frame that question or that response in a slightly adversarial way in hoping that you would explain it exactly the way that you did. So thank you so much, David. I agree with you that you have to accept that there is a magical nature to reality and to the mind and to all phenomena, sort of. I know I'm being reductive and sort of using my slightly normier approach, but I think it is a very important thing that you said. And I think sometimes I have gone a little severe in my articulation of the sort of non-supernatural, non-magical, and perhaps non-spiritualist nature of reality, simply because I just think it's important um, for me to set myself apart from people who would promote a wholly supernaturalist, spiritualist, dualistic, um, theistic externalities as the only sort of ontological reality. I just personally reject that. So I do tend to take a little bit of an adversarial position on that, but my actual position is much closer to what you just said. So thank you so much, David.
Adversarial is good because we're here to, exchange positions and refine statements, and it's wonderful to be able to do that. And I sympathize with exactly what we're talking about because that's how I started out. I started out as a practitioner of Hermetic Kabbalah in magical orders in the traditional Western sense, in a post-Golden Dawn context.
Well, we should talk about that, David. We should talk about like sort of your pivot to this kind of non-dual appraisal of the material and
Sure.
how you understand and how you came to this view.
Okay,
because you didn't just arrive at it, right?
No, I started out in Golden Dawn style orders over 35 years ago. In a variety of contexts, I was a member of several orders like this. All the ones that you suspect that I'm talking about are the ones that I'm talking about, including the OTO. And did that for a while until the early 90s, when I felt that I was hitting a wall. And the wall that I was hitting was a wall mostly based in the rigid nature of correspondences and correspondence systems, where you have, for example, and I'll just give an example here, the placement of the paths on the tree in a fixed position, where every connective path between Sphirot had a tarot card and a Hebrew letter and a numerical value and a color and all different correspondences, right? And you did ritual based on this correspondence vocabulary. Okay, that's fine for setting up a ritual. But then I started to encounter variations of these systems that had different correspondences. And then I found texts like the Partis Sermonim of the Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, in which multiple correspondences shifted around on the tree. And instead of being fixed and finite, you had a vocabulary of positions interchanging with each other. And that, how do you reconcile that? So the more I started to look into the sources of these correspondences in Hermetic Kabbalah, the more I saw that every particular school and system in the development of the subject had its own variation of these systems. So how do you reconcile that? Well, obviously, to work one, you have to be proficient in that one and understand its internal logic. And if you're going to limit yourself to one particular system, you have to become fluent in that. But if you want to understand how the whole field developed, you have to be fluent in a number of systems at the same time. Once you start doing that, you realize that each particular vantage point had something unique to offer that was a little different from all the others. And if you wanted to find out what these unique features were to the various systems, you had to develop the kind of fluidity to work multiple systems at the same time. And what happened with me is that I got greedy. I wanted to master them all. So I started to learn with various teachers, both in the Hermetic world and in the Jewish world. and I started developing proficiency in multiple Kabbalistic systems. Now, the systems that we're talking about here have a wide variety. We've already mentioned the system of Hermetic Kabbalah, but there's also the Lurianic system, and within that, there's multiple variations, actually many variations. Then there are schools from the 13th century that are a little bit different, that don't even use the Sphirot at all. Instead, they use poetic metaphors and sensations that are mostly evoked through contemplative practice. And here I'm speaking about, for me, what was the most important of these schools was the Iyun school of the 13th century, which was popularized probably mostly by a figure named Isaac the Blind. Then there are later developments that go in to the 18th and even early 19th century. Specifically for me, the systems of that later period, which were important, were systems that are from the Hasidic world, in particular the work of Rebbe Nachman of Breslov. So the interesting thing is that when I was developing proficiency in these various systems, I was doing them all simultaneously. I wasn't going from one to the other. And this gave me a kind of a bird's eye view of how correspondences worked and how flexibility had to be open in order to accommodate different variations, because we're really talking about something that is more similar than it is different. Sometimes the differences between systems are only very slight. So I immersed myself in all of these systems with various teachers and did this for quite a long time. And in the end, without even wanting to or without even trying, I began to amalgamate them and form a kind of a synthesis between them so that they could talk to each other. And what I was really doing was taking the parts that I connected to most deeply from each of these systems and extracting it and putting it together with other things that I deeply connected to in other systems and sort of letting the rest of it go. And if you think about it, I would have had to let it go because the majority of these other systems, especially in the Jewish world, had to do with things that I truly did not believe in, because I'm not a religionist. I don't believe in a creator God. I'm not out to uphold any mythology or, narrative that they're pushing that doesn't pertain to me. I'm only interested in the nature of phenomena. So what I extracted only related to that. And what I ended up assembling and amalgamating was my own systematic approach to the parts that I bonded with. And this is what I started to map out around 2006, 2007 in a series of notebooks. And that became the basis for the vocabulary of the work that I went on to do from that point forward. And I should say that in my history I was a visual artist up until 1996. And I was struggling in the art world, having shows and whatnot. That's back when the art world was in Soho and not in Chelsea in New York. And between the years of 1996 and 2006, I made no visual art whatsoever. I dedicated myself totally and completely to study and practice daily. If you'll excuse the term, balls out dedication, where take no prisoners. I'm not doing anything else. I don't care about anything else. I'll wear the same clothes every day, kind of attitude, single pointed. And all I did was study and practice for 10 years. Once I started to make the maps in 2006, I think that period of assimilation was over. And at that point, I concentrated on, this work is amalgamating in a way that I've never seen before. And these maps that I'm producing are visual documents. I didn't want to make artwork again. I don't care about being an artist. But I had to make these maps, these visual maps, because it was the only way that I could put together what I needed to put together. And that's when the work started to take off. And I started to make these drawings that were, in a way, sort of instruction manuals for the parts that I was amalgamating and the vocabulary that I was entering into. And it presented itself as a series of visions, places that you could enter with your mind that I drew out. And when people look at them, that's how they see them. They see them as sort of visionary drawings. But what they actually are is documents that amalgamated the parts that I had put together for 10 years. And that's how esoteric cartography got started.
I just want to say that is a great title. That's a great phrase. I am known as a word cell on Twitter sometimes, often, and my episode titles are pretty good if I have to say so myself. But I have to say, esoteric cartography might be. Might have to borrow that from you, David, for the episode title, just because it's so good.
Well, you wouldn't be the first. One of my best friends is a guy, a pretty famous composer who had a series of drawings that he showed at the Drawing Center in Manhattan, and he called his show Hermetic Cartography. And I called him up right as the book for the show was going to come out, and I said, "Hey man, you took my you took my title." So he wrote up a little paragraph in the beginning of the book saying, "Okay, I got this from David Chaim Smith." I wasn't mad about it, but he took my thing there, so I had to say something.
Well, full disclosure, it is David's bar, as the kids would call it, his line. It is definitely his title, so I did not cop it from him without telling him first. So you touched on two things. Well, everything you said was fascinating, David, but I want to address two things in particular. So the influence of how I started Kabbalah, as you and I have talked about privately, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, but as you know, Ramak played a big, probably the majority influence on my thinking of the tree after having sort of, we'll call it, traveled the tree conceptually with a different version, a Central Asian version. We don't have to get into that, but I think it helped me the most, Ramak. But I have been very much influenced by some of the ideas of Rebbe Nachman as well.
Well, let's make sure everybody knows what you mean by that. When you say the Ramak, you're using an acronym. We're talking about Rabbi Moshe Cordovero.
Yes.
Yeah. Want everybody to be clear about that.
Yes. Okay. Yes. I apologize.
Yeah.
Yes.
One of the most respected figures in the history of Kabbalah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so he has multiple, you know this, he has so many writings and tractates and commentaries, and so many of them not translated or not even very accessible. And I think that you've done a good job in sort of making at least his name and his work more well known at least to the broader, we'll call it, metaphysical public.
Well, the reason I was able to do that is I lucked out. It's not like I have such incredible Hebrew skills that I could do that. I was lucky enough to study with a rabbi who was an expert in Ramak, a real expert in Ramak, and that was his main system. And I was lucky enough to find this individual and study with him privately for about 2 years in his home at his kitchen table once a week. And that's all we did. And we hit it hard too. And he whipped out stuff that I wouldn't even be able to tell you where it is because my Hebrew isn't good enough. And, he had this stuff will never be translated, the stuff that we studied. And I don't even know how it could be found. I couldn't even backtrack it, but he would whip it out, and, we would jam out once a week in Teaneck, New Jersey. And this was a big part of my development. This was like towards the end of I guess it was 90, like in the late 90s, that we did this for almost 2 years. So I had a real oral tradition connection to Ramak there. That's how I have that aspect.
Well, I hope one day my karma is also as good as yours, David, so I can have that also experience. It would be a very humbling and incredible thing, I'm sure, to be taught. But I also wanted to say about Rebbe Nachman is that the show is called Threshold Saints. I've made reference to this before, but I wasn't aware of it particularly. I mean, I kind of was, but I wasn't fully. I wouldn't say I didn't have I did not have awareness, particular awareness or intention, maybe when I named the show, but I think maybe subconsciously I did reference his idea of like letting people know that they are Zodi or the Zodikim as plural. And so they have the potential at least to become it. And so it's not that I wanted to be like a gatekeeping show in any way. I wanted it to be like a sort of crazy mimetic chaos show that
well,
also
let's
talked
talk
about
about
those
that.
things.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
No, please do.
let's talk about that for a minute, because you just said something very interesting. Is like what I described with having this connection through study with this one particular rabbi to the system of the Ramak. The other opportunity I had to connect with a deeply oral, mouth to ear tradition was with the work of Rebbe Nachman of Breslov through another rabbi who was probably the rabbi I studied with for the longest period of time, for several years, again, one-on-one at the kitchen table in his home once a week as a regular student, regular basis, based on not only the work of Rebbe Nachman, but also the Lurianic support of it. So when we would study, we'd have the volume of Likutei Moharan by Rebbe Nachman and a volume of the Arizal, the Lurianic text, next to it. And we would go back and forth between one and the other. And this particular rabbi in Borough Park, Brooklyn, probably taught me the deepest mystical aspect of that tradition. And really, that's the guy that set me up for a life of doing what I'm doing. Now, the other thing that you said that was interesting, really interesting, was that the thing in Rebbe Nachman that lit you up the most was this idea that we could all be tzaddikim. Well, what you're talking about there is Buddha nature, the awakening principle within consciousness that can realize the purity of its own awareness. That doesn't change from person to person. It's not a product of the biological brain. It's not something that is born and will die. It is an unborn, undying essentiality that recognizes itself inherently. This awakening principle, the only thing that realizes it is the part of your own mind that arises and goes away. It's always in recognition of itself. It doesn't come and go, but our perceptions seem to come and go. So we could remember it, we could forget it, and we think that it's coming and going, but it's constant. Our minds are the things in flux here. So the goal of practice is to refine your own mind so that remembering and forgetting and coming and going becomes less and less of an issue, and ultimately becomes so subtle that it doesn't matter what thoughts blow like winds through the desert with the little tumbleweeds, thinking and feeling this or that sensation. The essence of the matter, the heart of the matter, doesn't change. And that's the awakening principle that is the tzaddik, that is the Moshiach. You know, people are used to thinking the Messiah, the Moshiach, is like a Christian or Jewish figurehead that's going to come down and save everybody. It could be Jesus. It could be the rebuilding of the third temple. It couldn't be further from the truth. The Moshiach principle is not a guy. It's not a dude. The Moshiach is the principle of awakening that's inherent in all of reality. It's in the rocks and trees. It's in the air. It's in the elements. It is mind itself in its essential quality, in its essential nature. And it awakens unto itself once the psyche becomes supple enough and translucent enough to get out of its own way. And that's what it's all about. And that is exactly what Rebbe Nachman was talking about. So I hope that I didn't interrupt you too bad. You were in the middle of saying something.
No, it was the perfect. It was kind of the perfect path or avenue to discuss exactly what you did. So thank you so much, David. That was very profound. I do want to ask you, perhaps it ties into everything that we've discussed, and maybe you're not interested in as a epistemological question, but I think that you will have an interesting answer, so I'm going to ask it regardless. I want to ask on the nature of the origin of Kabbalah. I know you've touched on it, and I wanted to ask about what you perceive or what you understand as the interrelationships as it relates to other systems. If you think,
what do you mean historically? You mean?
Yeah, historically, because you and I have spoken a little bit about this, about how there are certain links to Sufism, depending on how much emphasis you want to place on that, or to other sort of Central Asian formations. I just wondered if you could give either brief or long form, either or. Just like what is your kind of view of the cartographic landscape of like this idea and where it came from, and then how it kind of reformed, and then we can maybe bring it back to the 13th century.
Okay, well, I'm not a scholar, so I'm not the best person to talk about this. I don't really have much to say about the historical origins of things, because I'm just a contemplative practitioner. I was born at a time where I had all this material to choose from and could have the luxury to ignore contexts that bound people in previous generations. For example, I could extract what I inevitably extracted from the religious world and completely dump the religious content in which it was presented. None of my business. I don't care. I don't like it. I don't hate it. It's none of my business. So I could extract what I needed and leave the rest for someone else. Same thing with the occult world. All this stupid crap in the occult world that doesn't pertain to me, I can let that go too and just extract what I need. So I have the luxury to do that. But to answer your question, Kabbalah is a medieval invention. The origin of Hebrew Kabbalah is in the Temple period in late antiquity. But once the temple came down, once the Romans destroyed the temple and animal sacrifices could not be performed, the old ways of doing things were done. They were over. It had to be remade. And this is the Talmudic period of late antiquity, where they put together a whole new system. So to compare temple period mysticism, which involved the traditions that we would call the work of the Merkava, for example, was part of that system and forms of inquiry, with various schools, some of whom were extremely influential and profound, like the Essenes. Well, we don't really know what the Essenes did. We don't really know what any of the groups from late antiquity that didn't survive did. Just like we don't really know what historical ancient Hermeticism was about. We just have fragments. It's a broken tradition that didn't survive. All that's left are fragmentary texts and hearsay. So Kabbalah was reinvented after a form of the Jewish religion was put together after their temple was destroyed and everything was disrupted. And it had to be reborn in a new form at the medieval period. So everything we know about Kabbalah, with the exception of certain texts, which are legitimately ancient, like Sefer Yetzirah, all of it is medieval. And in the medieval period, you have influences from outside the Jewish world that Jews don't really like to acknowledge, profound influences, like Neoplatonism. A great deal of Kabbalah is simply Neoplatonism in a Jewish costume. And there are many aspects from the Hellenistic world that have filtered down through various traditions. Now, of course, Hermeticism is one of them, and Hermeticism is a Greco-Egyptian, a Greek-speaking Egyptian form of theurgy that really took root in the city of Alexandria in late antiquity. And we know that the city of Alexandria, where the ancient Hermeticists did their work, we know that there were plenty of Jews there. So there was a tremendous, we're talking about the time period of Philo of Alexandria, right? So we have a tremendous influx between Jewish Gnosticism of that period and this Greco-Egyptian Hermetic Gnosticism of that period. And the two combined beautifully. As a matter of fact, many scholars believe that there are chapters of the Corpus Hermeticum that are actually Jewish in origin, that are probably Jewish forms of Gnosticism of that period, because we know that the Corpus Hermeticum is not a cohesive book. It's a collection of parts. I mean, it's like the whole Nag Hammadi library is just a collection of parts. So we make assumptions based off of what we think or wish the connections were between these things, but we don't really know. So the only thing that I can be sure of, as somebody who's primarily not interested in scholarship, is what has worked for my practice. And when I look at what has worked for my practice, I see certain aspects from the Jewish world, certain aspects from the Hellenic world, certain aspects from Egyptian sources as well, coming together to form the basis of what by the Renaissance became known as the Western esoteric tradition. After Pico and after the developments in the city of Florence in the Renaissance, you have an amalgamation of these parts by necessity that was that coalesced based on function. What are the parts that actually work together? It doesn't matter if they change the original meaning of the context that has been long forgotten. What matters is what works for us in the moment of our usage of it. So from the Renaissance on, we have a tradition that we could say we're familiar with as Kabbalah and Hermeticism, because Renaissance Hermeticism is nothing like the Hermeticism of late antiquity. It had to be reinvented too. So we're talking about a system that constantly has to reinvent itself from all angles. Kabbalah had to die and come back to life. Hermeticism had to die and come back to life. So if you want to make any innovations, you have to change things. You can never be a slave to the past. That the measure of what has true value is what works for us in our living practice, which is utterly and completely unique. And for us to be beholden to some ideal from history simply because it's historical is anathema to my way of practice. So I change meanings all the time to fit what I need them to mean. And I take parts from different systems and put them where they don't theoretically belong. And I have no compunction about doing this, because really, I am not a scholar, nor am I after some sort of historical purity. What I'm after is a harmony between elements that allows this stuff to come to life. And that life is what I'm interested in exclusively. It's a good thing I'm not a scholar. I'd be a terrible scholar.
Well, I think you're an incredible scholar personally. I know you eschew the label, but I think that was an incredible answer. And I also agree with you 110% to use a magic number, or 220% even, in saying that I think that is exactly correct. I often frame it as, I just call it Aeon of the Daughter, meaning that we should not be tied to the institutional sort of formations of this way of thinking, and we should be more engaged in praxis. Now, you may agree or disagree with that sort of Klapothic label, but I have found a great deal of meaning in that. But I also think that it's good to be flexible. So I think that was a really great answer. I knew you had it in you to do something like that, to do an epic answer. So thank you so much. I do want to ask you maybe something a little off what we could talk about, but I think it's actually interesting. What is your sort of appraisal? I know you said you're really interested in your own mind and like your own experience in quote unquote reality and what that is. And I agree with that. But I also know that you are New York based, and I know that you have spent time in other places. And do you find there to be a sort of like underlying metaphysical nature that is perhaps distinct, maybe not different, but distinct in America or in places in America that is different from other places in the world? Or is it just a matter of consciousness, like the people who are in those places have sort of like a American consciousness, if you want to call it that, and so the nature of it thus appears in existence appearance differently? Or
Okay.
is it, yeah.
Okay, well, you have to look at when you're asking about the relative quality of things, like the attributes of things or the taste of things, right? That differ from time to time and place to place, moment to moment. You're talking about relative distinctions. And once you're talking about making these relative distinctions of the qualities of things, you ultimately are going to map them out into a kind of a hierarchy. So, on one level, you could say that there are regional distinctions in terms of place, where places feel different from each other. Then you have temporal distinctions between even those same places, that from time to time, places change the way they feel. Certainly, historical periods feel differently. So you have place and time constantly shifting. And the more sensitive you are to these quality distinctions, the more deeply that you feel them. And I generally refer to these modes of perceiving as feeling tone resonances. They're subtle etheric signatures, we could say, of times and places. And they are unmistakable. But then again, I'm so sensitive to that I feel different resonances from my front yard to when I cross the street. And how carried away do I want to get with these things? If I go into parts of America, I will feel various sensations that are generally true, but the more specific I start to hone in and focus on them, the more I realize that they are constantly shifting and constantly changing, and you can never really get a grasp of them. So when you're asking this question, you're asking it in a relatively general sense. So I'll give you you're with me so far, right?
I'm with you, and I agree. By the way,
Okay.
I
Okay.
just am asking it because I think, and to sort of end on esoteric cartography is very fitting, even if it's in a relative or general and generally relative way. I think it's still
Okay. So
interesting.
I'll give you a more general type answer now that I've set it up by saying all that stuff. When I was 15 years old, I hit the road. I wanted to explore and see the country. And I got in a van with somebody who drove it because I wasn't old enough to drive. And I hit the road, and I, became a traveler of sorts. And this was in the late 70s. And what I found was the last gasp of a dying animal, where the last true, authentic American regionalism could still be found. And by the early 80s, it was gone. But in the late 70s, I caught it a little bit, where the regional character of times and places still had their, original regionality, and those flavors were still there. You went to the South, it was really the South. You went to Montana, it was really Montana. People spoke different, people acted different. It wasn't just a big strip mall. Now you go to India and it's like New Jersey. Or I should say, India is like New Jersey, New Jersey's like India. Globalism killed all that. But outside of these sort of geopolitical and cultural factors. The question is, what's the etheric signature on a deeper, more subtle level? And I couldn't honestly tell you what the gestalt of America was or is at this point, because I don't live in it. I went into retreat in 2013. I went into solitary 3-year retreat. And when I came out of the 3-year retreat, I went into a sort of semi-open retreat for 10 years in a house where I basically wrote my books with my wife and whatnot. And I didn't participate in the culture, and I didn't travel, and I didn't really talk to people. So I don't know. The America that I remember growing up in, I'm sure it's gone, and I don't know what replaced it. I don't know what's out there. And frankly, it's none of my business, because I still just stay in my house and do my work. I'm not connecting with the spirit of the land or the people or any of that stuff. I'm ignorant of it. You know, it's not the territory where I spend my time. So I have really very little to say about it. But the state of being human in 2026 that I have any knowledge of doesn't really matter whether I'm in London or Moscow or Mexico City or New York. You know, what the people that I communicate with based off of my work, they talk to me about my work, and how it affects them shows a series of problems that are, you know, contemporary problems that are endemic. But I don't sense it regionally anymore at all. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. It actually, I think it connects the nodes in a way, in a fundamental way, of exactly what I was asking. The subtle layer of all of these things, and then the nature of the mind and what you're focused on and how you live your life. Because I think that is truly your great work, is the way you live your life.
Yeah, the way I live my life is I try to stay in my practice and do my work and write my books, and my wife and I put out the books, and she and I live in our own little world, you know, and that's all I know anymore. I'm in my mid 60s, and if I'm lucky, I got 10, 20 years left, and I'll just continue to do what I do. But, you know, I had a pretty wild life, which I'm happy to talk about. I got a million stories about.
I'd love to hear some David Chaim Smith wild stories from his youth.
Oh,
if you don't mind sharing.
You know, I grew up at a time and place that was, you know, completely different than now. I grew up in the New York City area in the 70s. You know, I was a little kid in the 60s. By the time I was old enough to know what was going on, it was the 70s already. And it was crazy. New York City was crazy in the 70s. And I was a very troubled kid who got into a lot of trouble. I was troubled and I got into trouble. And I was eventually, you know, by the time I don't know how much of this you really want to hear, but by the time I was 4 years old, I was put in a special school, an institution for fucked up kids. And and I was there for the entirety of my childhood, from 1969 to 1976. And most of the other kids in this place were either retarded or severely autistic or antisocial, which was on what was on my jacket, because of I'd committed enough atrocities by 4 years old that they put me in here. That's a little weird to say, but it's actually true. It was a day school, so the little yellow bus took me home at night. And you know, eventually I was released out onto the world in 1976, and that's when the trouble started. I have a lot of stories about being a little kid in the city. The first time I got off the train at Penn Station and went up the escalator and onto the street. I think I was 11 years old or 10 years old or something like that. I walked 1 block, and in less than a block and a half or 2 blocks, somebody was murdered right in front of me. And I had brains on my shoes. So I had to do some quick thinking. And at that age, the only thought that was in my mind about what this meant was something that stuck with me throughout that whole period of my life, which is, this is the world that I live in. This is not a kind or gentle world. This is a severe world. And I better fucking adjust right now to the reality of the savagery on the street. Because I don't really have a choice. I'm not going down with the ship. There's something I got to do. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to live. I'm going to stay alive, and I'm not going to show weakness. So I got to stand the ground, you know? And as a result, I internalized how truly scared I actually was, and tried as hard as I could to act as if I wasn't scared at all. And this resulted in getting pretty good at masking my internal state and presenting a state like everything was fine. What are you talking about? There's no problem. You know, and that's the way I had to survive. So based on that skill of appearing composed, when in reality, internally, I was very not composed, that saved my life. And I have this ability to talk. So I'm not a tough guy, you know, so I can't fight my way out of situations, but I can talk my way into or out of anything. And that saved my life so many times. That quick thinking allowed me to say the right thing to the right person and not get killed. And, you know, this is why I'm still here. So I don't know where you want me to go with the stories, but.
Well, I think it's interesting, David, simply because it is kind of something that I've often repeated, is that you have to be able to get there in your mind, despite carnal ground conditions. And I think that's a perfect illustration of that exact idea, perhaps, in all its brutality and reality and everything that means. So,
well, you know, what happened to me was drugs, basically, and I've been sober since 1990. So that's 36 years. I've been, I've had the wherewithal of clarity of mind. So not being high has been my greatest asset. I could never have done any of the things that I did in the past 35 years if, for example, I was smoking pot every day like I used to. So that's what did it for me, is not being fucked up. I mean, that's what changed my life.
well, not being fucked up is a good resolution to many paradoxes, we can say, for sure.
Yeah, clarity is amazing, and its opposite creates problems. And there's no way I would have been able to do the kind of work that I went on to do if I was impaired. It just would have been impossible.
Okay, David. So I'm going to ask you a question for people that are listening, but it's sort of for myself, but I think it's more for people that are listening. But you can answer it in whatever way that you want. If you could recommend them one David Chaim Smith to purchase,
One book?
Sorry, what book? One book from you, at least one book, or whatever book you want. Where do you think people should start?
Are you asking about my work in specific?
Well, why don't you, if you want to give one of your works, I think that would be great. If you want to give one of your works and something else to read as a companion piece, that I think also would be great. Or you can answer it in whichever way that you will.
I honestly, I could give you the PR answer where I'm promoting my work and
You should do so.
a bushy little tailed go-getter who's out to promote their brand. I could go that way, or I could be honest with you. I think I'll just be honest with you.
Okay.
Honestly, I don't think it matters what books you read. I don't think the books are really that important. I think what's actually important is the use of your mind. And I think that if people really want to make something of their lives and not waste their lives, they should just sharpen their ability to perceive clearly and openly and spaciously. And then it doesn't matter whether you read any given book or you don't read the book or you learn this bit of information or that information. I think the main thing is to just start with your own awareness and honor it. Honor your own awareness as what's really important, because the essence of your awareness, the heart of your own mind, is Or Ein Sof. Either you believe me or you don't believe me, or you care or you don't care. That's where I'm coming from. So if anybody has any curiosity about any of these things that I'm saying, start with your own mind and reassess what that opportunity actually is. And then it's never about a book. You could throw the books in the garbage. If you have your own mind and the wherewithal to examine it, you are automatically at the apex of the pyramid. And from that standpoint, you could look to this book or that book as good sources of information, but the mind is what it's about, not the books. So that's the honest answer.
I mean, that was a mic drop answer, so I couldn't really ask for better. But you should give a little PR. You should give one. It's okay to be a little striver. I'm telling you as a millennial, David, it's okay to be a little bit striver. So you should give one of your books just as a PR answer. And also it makes me look cool. So people listening to it will be like, oh yeah, David didn't have a problem like saying to Jin, like, buy this book.
Okay, I'll give the cool answer. Well, I just released a book called Two-Headed Arrow, and it just came out, I don't know, 4 days ago. And people are buying it already. It's already in certain stores like Watkins Book in London. You can get it there. You can get it at, I don't even know, whatever the stores are where these things are. And Two-Headed Arrow is an interesting kind of book because it's a commentary on a short text that I wrote in what's called a twilight language. A twilight language is a language of pure symbol that sits right between discursive conceptuality and the areas of communication that language can't get to. So it's in this sort of slippery territory where symbols are alluding to things that language can't quite sum up or grasp, but they're there. And in this twilight territory, you could really profoundly connect to things at the absolute outer limits of our linguistic capacities, but it requires thinking and commentary and consideration. So I have this short text, which is basically 9 verses. And the text is called The Two-Headed Arrow Flies Broken. And I wrote commentary on each of the 9 verses. So it's 9 chapters. Each one is a verse of the Twilight text, and I write commentary on that one. And of course, I have my pictures in there. I have diagrams in there, which are new diagrams that were made at this time period, relate to the material. And Two-Headed Arrow is a very special text because this Twilight text, the 9 verses, appears in other forms in other books of mine. I'm continually refining and working on this text, and it's always changing. And it's a very strange thing because I keep coming back to it and reinventing it. So I wrote commentary on another form of it in a book called Psychoetheric Alchemy, Volume 1, and that was like 2 or 3 years ago. And then again, before that, in some of my Lightning Flash books, I covered some of that territory. But each time it's totally new. These series of images, these series of symbols that are conjoined in this very specific way. And the way that the symbols are conjoined, I could describe to you very quickly. And there's a story that goes along with it where I was in a context of practice and I was learning from somebody and they told me to go to sleep. The person I was learning with said, go back and go to sleep. And I wondered, like, why are they telling me to go to sleep? Is there some reason they're telling me to go to sleep? But when I went to sleep, I fell asleep very quickly. And I can't really say that what I had was a dream. I think what happened was a hypnagogic state. And in this visionary episode that I had in this state of semi-sleep, there was a sword that was on fire, and the sword thrust into the air and became an arrow. And the arrow was soaring through the air. And then the arrow that was soaring through the air became the sky into which it was flying. So sword to arrow, arrow to sky. That's the basis of this text. The sword cuts through the gross level klipot. The arrow flies through the ethers, and ultimately the flight of the ethers becomes the expanse in which the ethers are presented and expressed. And that's the path. That's the entirety of the path. So the whole thing is like really functioning on that kernel of symbols. That little conjunction of symbols can be elaborated upon for hundreds of pages. And that's how the Twilight language works. And this book, Two-Headed Arrow, is really just like an elaboration on that conjunction, if that makes sense.
Well, I can't wait to read it personally. I think that it sounds incredible. I think the arrow and the sword symbolism has a great deal of personal and aeonic meaning to me. And the way that I've expressed it in other shows on the Grey Lodge, which is our group show, and on this show, and on Rejects as well. And so if people are interested in like hearing me talk about it without appraising David's work, they can go listen to the old episodes. But in the future, I probably will reference David's work simply because I'm sure it will influence me in profound ways that I'm not yet, I'm just not yet aware. So thank you so much, David, for sharing that. I really was glad that you did.
Yeah, it'll be up there in Canada where you are. Gabriel at Anathema just got a whole bunch of copies of the book, and he's going to be distributing it up there for Canadian friends. And it's funny because I've talked about that conjunction of sword, arrow, sky a number of times. Not only have I written about it in a bunch of books, but I've talked about it in interviews quite a lot. I did a bunch of interviews with Greg Kaminsky from Occult of Personality on this.
Shout out, Greg, friend of the show.
Yeah, years ago. So obviously I've been working on this for years, and that's the thing about working with a group of symbols. You don't necessarily have to have that many, and you don't necessarily even have to change them. But the relationship to truly profound symbol sequences grows over time and becomes deeper the more that you immerse in it. So years, decades go by, and you could be working the same group of symbols, and it just gets deeper and deeper and deeper the longer you keep doing it. And it's really amazing because people creative people generally are always inventing new content. What I do invents new content, but that's sort of beside the point. You don't have to invent new content. You just have to go deeper in the content that you already have. And that is where you go beyond the boundaries of language and the boundaries of conceptuality and can really enter into subtle territories where the meaning, that the state of being that you are embodying becomes the content rather than the words or the descriptions or the data or the information or the mechanical descriptions, whatever they may be. So, that's what esoteric cartography is really mapping out. It's mapping out how the presence of being itself is expressed in what it means, what its implications are, if that makes sense.
Yes, I'm just I'm processing it. I'm sort of I agree, David. I mean, there's no this is I mean, you know this. I've told you this before, is that your work to me is like it's the closest that I've personally come to where it's expressing something that I experientially recognize, because I'm much more of an experiential Kabbalist, and I've also admitted this to you, that I am like a scholastic or even a mystic practitioner who's like serious about study. I mean, yeah, I am, but I am also, the way that I understand the tree is fundamentally from my earliest and initial experiences, which obviously led into my later kind of like Sephardic visionary experiences, to borrow your language. So I mean, I cannot say how grateful I am that you agreed to sit down with me, that you agreed to discuss your work with me, and that you were able to. I think it was such a broad range of like how I think it was almost like a Sephardic path working, speaking with you, if I'm being honest with you. I know this is
Well,
very conceptual.
not a lot of people ask me. It's funny because my books sell pretty well, so I know that people are interested in the books because they buy them. But not a lot of people ask me to talk with them on podcasts. It just doesn't happen that much. They used to. I'm not really sure why it kind of dropped off, but I love talking about the work. And I wish that people would ask me to do it more often because I take great pleasure in it. I'm really not concerned with much else in life. I just do this. I mean, I'm really, I guess, from a conventional standpoint, very boring person. But yeah, I love to have conversations like this. So thank you for allowing me to. I really appreciated all the nice things that you said as well. I appreciate
Well,
it.
it's a huge honor, and so thank you, David, and of course you're welcome, and you're welcome. You are legitimately welcome on. I say this often to people, but I usually don't have people on if I'm not comfortable with having them on again. And so I just wanted to say that this conversation went, even though I had very high expectations, simply because I think you're incredible, and the work is incredible. But I also had high expectations for myself. But I'm actually relatively confident, in the way that I represented myself, and also very confident in the ways that you represented yourself in your work and sort of the public discourse, which is where I think some interesting magic, maybe not all, it's not like the fundamental reality of magic, but I think in discourse, something really interesting can arise. And I really love being in dialogue. And I really, again, appreciate being in dialogue specifically with you. And so if you ever want to come back, please do. And, I am kind of known on Twitter, David, as being a little bit avant garde, a little very edgelord. And so what happens usually is that I invite people on, authors, and a few months later, maybe not right away, but a few months later, they start to appear on a lot of other people's shows. So let me just put that on the Aether Wave right now, that I am saying to them, I will not take it in offense, or I will be flattered if people ask you on from my greater sphere and my greater circle. So thank you again,
Well,
David. Really appreciate it.
I you do whatever you want with your show, and obviously I would never suggest that your show should be this way or that way. But if I were you, I wouldn't edit this at all, because I think the entire flow of this conversation was perfect just the way it is, with no edits.
Perfect. then that's exactly how it will be.
Yeah.
We'll let it be.
And having said that, when you called me up and said, okay, let's go this afternoon and I'll be ready, I was even questioning myself because I just ate a tremendously big lunch where I had 2 gigantic Indian dosas. And I thought, well, I'm just going to go to sleep. I'm 60 something years old, Okay, I'm just going to take a nap. But then I thought, oh, well, talk about the work, huh? Well, that perks me right up. So,
well, I'm glad it could be edifying. I'm glad that I didn't embarrass you as like your junior compatriot in this Sephardic journey. And so I hope that I don't want to say made you proud, but I hope that you feel it was worthwhile. And I'm glad to hear that you say that. So
yeah, the fact that I think that you shouldn't edit it means like it really worked. It was like a spontaneous expression of our aspirations that converged in and coalesced and crystallized in a way that was perfect for what it was. So if it's broke, don't fix it, as Billy Bob Thornton once said.
I think that's a perfect way to end. And so we'll end there. And I think that you're right in that maybe there was a glimmer of the lightning flash between us. So
I hope so. I mean, hopefully that's what we're shooting for all the time.
All the time. I agree. Thank you so much, David, and have a great evening.
Can we stay on and talk for a minute?
Absolutely.